Hello. Hello. Hi, welcome to Democracy Day presentation number 3. This presentation is called The Prose of Protest, and it's presented by Dr. Joe Baumann, an esteemed member of our English department. We welcome you today for this particular presentation. Once we are finished with the presentation, there will be Q&A to talk, to share, to engage. And we also have other presentations throughout the week. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Joe Baumann.
Thank you, Marvin. And good afternoon, and thank you to all of you for being here, for coming to this session of the 2023 Democracy Days titled The Prose and Poetry, because we actually have a poem as well, of Protest. This is the 6th hosting of this particular panel, and I'd like to begin with just a brief introduction of what we will be doing today. 2 students enrolled in various creative writing courses here at SCC, along with myself, will be sharing pieces of writing they've been working on prompted by the notion of protest, however they have chosen to interpret that prompt. Before I read my own work of that sort and then turn over the microphone to our student readers, I just want to give a very quick history of writing as protest, and then I will share that little bit of my own protest prose. So there's no denying that we live in an age of protest. While protest has been a part of the American and world landscape for centuries, millennia, eons, it is clear that more and more members of the public at large have taken up the task of marching, striking, and shouting against injustice and imbalance, however it is individuals define those things. Whether it is in response to inequities, Wall Street greed, political misbehavior, or abuse by those in positions of power, protest has taken on an omnipresent place in the American landscape. That said, today we're here to speak of a different kind of protest, one that does not occur on the streets or the foot of Capitol buildings, but one that comes to life on the printed page, in bestsellers, on websites, in the glossy, flippable pages of magazines and newsprint, the writing of protest. These days, it's not surprising to see a writer get political, but this politicizing of writing is hardly new and is arguably present in every piece of written art that exists in the world. Ever since the written form has existed, it's been used as a method of protest. The earliest Greek writers, from Sappho to Aristophanes to Homer, utilized their poetry as a way to rally against kings. Shakespeare, the bard himself, wrote scathing sonnets and plays as a way to mock and question the positions taken up by the British monarchy. Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, in which he satirically suggests the eating of children as a way to survive the potato famine that plagued Ireland in the 18th century, can be viewed as a form of parodizing protest. His message, clearly, is that every solution those in power have come up with is so stupid, we might as well eat our kids instead. And in America, writers like Jesmyn Ward, Alice Walker, Yosef Komunyakaa, Joseph Cassara, Amiri Baraka, Gloria Anzaldúa, Imani Perry, Natasha Trethewey, Joy Harjo, Margot Jefferson, Ibram X. Kendi, David Truer, Howard Zinn, Amina Forma, Barbara Ransby, Lillian Smith, and Karen Ishizuka, just to name a few, have spent their lives, their entire writing careers, protesting marginalization, subjugation, and inequities that are at the heart of our country's function and founding and day-to-day life. Contemporary writing, and I use this term to encompass not just fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, but song lyrics, theatrical scripts, and the screenplays for film and television, even tweets and Instagram posts and TikToks, have embraced protest as one of its major purposes. Dozens of literary journals and anthologies exist that respond to what? To presidential and legislative activities and behaviors, as well as forms of institutional and large-scale prejudice when it comes to race, gender, sexuality, and more. American Horror Story even took up the 2016 election as a subject, exaggerating the grotesquerie that is the American political landscape. Some people complained that Star Wars Rogue One painted its evil empire as too similar to a particular political party's leadership. As the 2020s sees a revolting rise in book banning and the silencing of marginalized voices, writers have struck out louder and louder in response to the notion that artists should be non-political. Ask any writer to do so, and they might laugh or look puzzled, because removing the political, the protestation, from art is all but impossible. I frequently see people demanding that athletes, commentators, public figures, celebrities, etc. stop getting political. And I find such a request hard to understand. As members of a country that values its freedoms, speech, assembly, to be religious or free from religion, it is incumbent upon all of us to speak using whatever vehicles and microphones, even the literal ones, that we have available to us. For writers, the megaphone is the pen. Our voices are words. As I mentioned at the beginning, today 2 of our students will share their own protest writing. Each will be sharing a piece of their own creation with you, and afterward we will have plenty of time for questions. But I ask that these questions be limited to a discussion of the writing process, the writer's work, or how our writers view art as having a place in protest. While discussions of various political positions is fruitful and important, that's not quite the focus of this panel today. If you want to discuss your feelings about the content of the work with any of the writers, I invite you to seek them out individually. So I will begin by way of, not example, but breaking the ice, so to speak, with a short little piece that I suppose I might call protest prose. So this is a little story called Crying Boys Welcome Here. The sign on the door reads, Crying Boys Welcome Here. Inside, they're arranged in a circle, hunched on squeaky metal chairs, faces blurry like foggy windshields, 12 pairs of cheeks, lobster claw red. They hold paper cups filled with water poured from a decanter on a table next to an untouched platter of cookies. The boys range in age, pubescent adolescents through college graduate, some of their bodies filled with baby fat, others long-armed and skinny-limbed, bearded and pimpled, peach and jiggly. One is shaped like a linebacker, thighs pressing against the fabric of his jeans. Another wears a wife beater, his cratered muscles scarred by cigarette burns. For the longest time, they say nothing, their sniffles and hiccups the only noise in the small, damp room that feels like a cell, the gray bathwater of the sky eking in through high, narrow windows. The light is tired, fluorescent bulbs sharp and biting, half of them snapped off. A chalkboard at one end of the room is a dead black void, swished with white, notes erased from some previous meeting like streaks of dried quartz. The boys sip from their cups stained by the mucky drip of their wet noses. They look at one another and sigh, warm comfort eating up their insides. The football player catches the eye of the smallest boy, so tiny his cargo shorts reach closer to his ankles than his knees. He presses his lips into a smile and waggles his fingers. The little boy squirms in his seat, happiness warring with his sadness. If they're waiting on a leader, no one says so. No one glances toward the closed door with its picture window, wired and glazed so as to distort the view in each direction. Someone peeking in would see fuzzy phantoms, their identities washed out of focus. The boys simply sit, each in a different stage of sobbing. A few are just getting started, warm salt gathering in the corners of their eyes, wet heat mounting in their throats. The boy with the burned shoulders is climbing toward full height, his tears stitched with tight sobs, begging to be allowed to stretch out to their truest depths. The football player is on the downswing, his choking hiccups subsiding, the froggy feeling in his throat turning to ashy relief. No one says, "Are you okay?" No one says, "What's wrong?" No one says, "Boys don't cry." Because here, boys do cry. Here, crying boys are welcome. Here, the boy whose father won't play catch with him is not told that he's a baby for letting out the harsh loneliness running up and down his spine. Here, the 15-year-old who aches because his friends don't know he's gay and make homo jokes all the time won't be smirked at for feeling pain. Here, the boy who loves his girlfriend so much it makes him sob can sob. The 19-year-old punk rocker doesn't have to hide that YouTube videos of soldiers returning home from the Middle East make his chest throb. The burnt boy doesn't have to pretend his father's cigarettes don't hurt. A boy with green eyes like shards of emerald exhales, a sharp, high noise like a train whistle. The other boys blink their pink-ringed eyes at him and lean back as if blown by a hardy sea wind. I just get sad when I think of my mother, he says, voice trembling and soft. He looks at his stomach and adjusts his button-down linen shirt. She and my father are divorced. She's unemployed and cries when she folds the laundry. The noise makes me cry too. The football player nods. My dad used to hit me. If I cried, he'd hit me harder. They go round and round like a game of somber musical chairs, announcing the sources of tears, lost grandparents, dead beagles, alcoholic uncles, Josh Groban songs, painful headaches, sibling rivalries. No one criticizes, no one ranks. There are no winners. The boys nod at one another. Hands reach out and clap shoulders. Soon they are standing and embracing, squeezing fatty palms against backs, pressing arms around frail ribs. Their sobs increase in tenor and pitch and intensity when their faces are in heated, seasoned proximity. I think I'll take a cookie, the burned boy says, his scars winking in the light when he shifts his weight. They all take cookies. Crumbs cling to their lips. They giggle at chocolate smears. They refill their cups and have drinking contests to see who can chug the fastest. They laugh and they cry and they wipe at their cheeks. The football player lifts the tiny boy onto his shoulders and rushes around the chairs in a zooming circle, making the sounds of an engine shifting gears. They play Simon Says. They play charades. They play telephone. The room has no clock, and none of the boys sneak furtive glances at their cell phones. Facebook, Snapchat, and Twitter are all ignored. After a particularly warped round of telephone, there's a pretty dog here becomes, can you buy me beer? They laugh until they cry again. More secrets spill out like candy, punches and pinches, abortions, nightmares about lost dogs, tearing up while watching romantic comedies and Titanic, feeling overweight, feeling underweight. Minutes tick by in heavy silence. The door remains closed. Outside, the world whirls by, time oozing like gunk squelching into a storm drain. No one moves to leave. Here, they are crying boys. Here, they can slather and screech and squirm and sense. They can feel and flail and flutter. Their hearts can beat and break and melt and mend. Out there, they must be stoic and smart and strong and senseless. Here, the crying boys are friends, comrades, soulmates. There, they are boys, a dozen apostles waiting for a savior who may never arrive. The end. Thank you. And now I would invite our first reader, Sydney Coyne, to the podium.
I'm very short, I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm really nervous. I'm gonna do my best. But this piece is called Resist. He needs status and a slave. You will help him obtain these. With a ring on your finger, you are no longer you. You are him. Please do not resist. Please do not resist. You wouldn't know the meaning of the word. What would Anonymous have to defend you? Your word means nothing anyway. Please do not resist. Unintentionally, they put a quill in your hand. Your sons need teaching, they command. And for the first time, willingly, you do not resist. Your breasts have cancer? We will remove all the muscles in your upper arms. But we are saving your life. You are no longer beautiful, and you are no longer wanted. Please do not resist. To the majority, you were just a body, or you were just a number. 3/5 a person, and ordered not to resist. Or maybe your hair was cut, and disease was shoved down your throat. Uprooted from your home, a cross shoved through your heart, and they say, please do not resist. Make love, not war, but don't use a condom. And for God's sake, don't take the pill. Then you made a baby. Please do not resist. You want to marry your own gender. It's just a phase. You'll marry the opposite of you, since there are only two. And do not resist. Our rules and regulations belong in your body, so do not resist, or you will be punished. And yet, by conforming, you already are. Thank you.
Oh, you are short. I know. Thank you, Sydney. And our second reader is Jan U. Daly. Or whatever. The next one.
My prose is a short story about someone struggling with protesting. I did some revamps over lunch, so I hope I can keep it all straight. I don't protest. The declaration seemed to come out of nowhere as my friend Sandy sat fiddling with her coffee cup, turning it around, checking to see how much she had left. She looked around the small cafe as if checking to see if anyone had heard her short declaration, like it was a big reveal with dangerous consequences. It's not like I haven't had plenty of opportunities. When you're born during the Korean War and have lived as long as I have, there have been many, many opportunities, but I've always been in the bleachers, sometimes cheering, sometimes booing. I wasn't sure where this conversation was going or why it was even happening. I wasn't her father confessor or her mother superior, but someone who had known her for years and had shared many cups of coffee in cafes like this one. Maybe it was looking around and seeing the posters calling us to wake up and participate. There was one asking for attendance at the school board meeting to protest book banning. Another one was out of date with last week's march on the City Hall to support the homeless. And it seemed like no one could dress these days without making a statement. Some were golden oldies, like the elderly hippie wearing "Make Love, Not War." Some were subtle and only discernible to those who paid attention. I can't breathe. I watched Sandy stare into her cup, looking for something. Courage to speak out loud the turmoils I saw on her face, an answer as to whether or not she dared to keep sharing whatever was obviously troubling her. Suddenly she said, "I need a refill. Do you?" And with that, she was up and quickly off to the barista counter. She returned with 2 cups of fresh coffee and a determined look on her face. I wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but I was pretty sure she had made a decision while watching the milk stage its own noisy protest against the steaming treatment it was receiving. Sandy looked around the room with all of its energy and engagement, then turned to me with a rueful, lopsided half-smile and began to tell me what was on her mind. I was in high school during the Vietnam War. My senior year, that was 1969. All the guys in my class were nervous about the draft lottery. I remember the relief they felt when they drew a high number. That and going to college might help them avoid service without having to admit they were scared shitless. It was a strange time. No one really wanted their son to go halfway around the world to fight an enemy that had done nothing to us. But at the same time, you had to believe the president and McNamara when they said we had to disrupt the domino effect and stop communism in its tracks. If that meant fighting an enemy we couldn't see, to lose our boys while taking the same hill over and over, then so be it. I nodded in agreement, even though my understanding was from studying history. I was a few years younger than she, but those years made such a difference in how we experience world events. Sandy picked up the thread of her thoughts and continued. There was a time when most people thought the government was trustworthy and would never lie to us just to support and obscure its hubris. We kept falling for General Westmoreland's optimism based on nothing. That more soldiers, more tanks, more planes, more bombs, more time was all he needed to defeat the enemy. Reporters stood in front of dead Viet Cong soldiers piled in stacks, giving us the body count for the day, as if it was the score of a Saturday afternoon college football game. Night after night, for months, Walter Cronkite gave us the tally until even he couldn't keep quiet about the futility of this war. Sandy paused as I watched her relive those images. Then she looked at me and started again. I went to a tiny conservative Christian college. While students were being massacred at Kent State, our student body was all gathering in front of the administration building for a group photo to send to Nixon, proving our support of him and his Vietnam policies. I remember my confusion when I saw one male student wearing a black armband. He was severely reprimanded by the dean of students and almost expelled. I look back now on my cluelessness, which feels so selfish, and I wonder why I didn't get it. I know my world was contained in an almost cult-like fundamentalist raising, but I did see the news, and I had at least two professors who courageously questioned the pat answers I was given and taught. And there were all those students at other colleges who understood what was happening. How could I have been so completely ignorant of any involvement or response? I watched Sandy struggling with her memories, looking back in judgment on her younger self. I knew I couldn't absolve her of her perceived sins of omission, nor did I think she would receive that if I tried. She sat quietly for a moment, then looked up at me and resumed her confession. I was in high school when Dr. King shared his dream, but I was aware during my younger years of racial unrest and the horrible treatment of those who spoke up. We visited my grandparents and aunts and uncles in South Texas, where I heard of how interfering Yankees were coming down there to stir up trouble, how the Negroes wanted to live separately and be left alone, and how that had worked just fine for everybody until those damn Yankees showed up. No one mentioned that separate was not equal, or that a person shouldn't have to endure a beating just so they could vote. I don't recall my parents responding one way or the other. I don't recall us discussing it, but somehow I knew my Texas relatives were wrong. I remember seeing the marches on the news and being horrified as German shepherds and full-force fire hoses attacked people who were asking for no more than their constitutional rights as American citizens. I remember wondering at the courage of the Freedom Riders and all those who helped them and all those who followed their example. There have been other issues, women's rights, gay rights. I've benefited from others' efforts, but I've done nothing to earn the privileges. I'm not sure why this is bothering me so much today. Maybe it's an accumulation of all the years that I've watched the outrage and done nothing. I feel like a fraud when I think of what I get to enjoy without having earned it. My wife and I have been married for 10 years, for Christ's sakes, and I did nothing to help make that legal. On the books, at least, I have all the rights of voting and ownership and employment as men, and I interrupted Sandy with a growling scowl and raised eyebrows. I know, but can we not do our bodies our choice today? There's only so much self-flagellation I can handle in one setting. But as I was saying, I just feel so fraudulent today, and it's miserable because I know I'm not going to change and start charging the barricades. I wanted to respond to Sandy, but wasn't sure how. I needed a break to give me some time to think, and there was no better break than pastries. So I came up with a suggestion. We've sat here long enough after our breakfast that I need something sweet. Let's peruse the pastry case and get a fresh cuppa. We returned to our table, reinforced with flaky delectables and fresh hot caffeine. We spent some time comparing our treats and giving each other bits to justify our exclamations of, "Oh my God." Eventually, I looked at Sandy and asked, "Do you think you could hear a couple of thoughts I have about what you've shared? Not going to try and change your mind. Some things that have come to me as you were talking." "Sure." First, a question. Why do you think, deep down, you don't go to protest? My friend looked at me for a minute and then sighed as if letting go of a burden. Two things. One is they honestly look kind of scary and out of control, and that's not my vibe at all. And secondly, I think these issues are complicated and can't fit on an angry sign. But at the same time, I know things don't change without passion or some in your face. We're mad as hell and not taking it anymore. I nodded. Let's save that for later. So that kind of out there demonstration is not for you. Let me tell you what I do see you doing, in no particular order. You hung a Biden-Harris banner from your deck when you lived in a scarlet red town, while your neighbors flew Trump Pence flags. And you wore a Biden-Harris t-shirt with rainbow colors all over that town. You mentored an inner city sixth grade girl for a year and a half when all that was expected was 6 weeks. And you gave her amazing experiences that she would never had otherwise. You never miss voting on all levels of our government. When you started working on a campus where the majority of students were Black or immigrants, you signed up on your own dime for seminars and classes on all types of cultural sensitivity and understanding. You worked for 17 years as an advocate for disabled students to make sure they received the accommodations legally mandated for them under the Civil Rights Act. Was that just a job for you? I think not. You give money every month to NPR and PBS because you believe in a free and unfettered press. You subscribe to the newspaper even though you think it has deteriorated so much in the past years because you believe every town needs its local press. You give to an international aid organization that you checked out to make sure the money was actually used to help the disaster victims. You give locally to many causes. You volunteered at the library and ended up getting up every Saturday morning at 4:30 for a year and a half to drive a patron to her kidney dialysis appointment because there was no public or social transportation available to her. When you meet someone for the first time, you always introduce Mary Lou as your wife. The list goes on, but that's a good start. Now, before you start dismissing these things as something anyone would do, no, they're not. I'm not saying you're some kind of hero. I'm saying there are so many ways to affect change in this world, and for most of us, it's in our daily lives and the decisions we make. We need protesters, and we need everyday folks living out what they believe. What we don't need are people trying to make themselves into something they aren't. Be true to you, and like the man said, keep the faith, baby. Sandy looked at me as if she might believe me someday. We parted ways with hugs and take care. I watched her leave as I went to buy my husband and the kids some sweet treats. I thought of how her struggles were like so many others who were paying attention. It does feel so damn complicated these days. Seems like there's only us who are obviously right, or them who are obviously crazy. All we can do is keep talking and take care of what we see in front of us. I paused and let our conversation sink in a bit more. I smiled. Maybe it was time to dig out my own "Keep Your Hands Off My Body" t-shirt, and for me to keep the faith, baby.
Okay, really quickly before we move to our Q&A portion, it's very hard, especially if you haven't done it very often, to share your creative output in front of an audience of any size. So can we give Jan and Sydney one more round of applause, if for nothing else, their bravery and willingness to do so. Oh, I do this all the time, it's fine. Okay, so now Marvin Tobias back there has a microphone, and we have plenty of time. So if you would like to ask a question to any or all of the panelists, again, about their writing, about the process, about the premise of protests or anything of that sort, just raise your hand and he will be happy to come around and be thrilled to take your questions. Don't be shy.
Don't all ask questions all at once.
There's plenty of time. Please dig deep and come up with a question for these esteemed panelists. Yes.
How did you make the choice for poetry versus short story?
I think to both of you.
To both of us?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, please.
So I chose poetry because I wasn't entirely sure how much time I would have, and I knew I couldn't put what I wanted to say into a short story and give it the same impact that I was hoping to achieve. And I also knew I would ramble. So poetry is a good way for me to kind of keep it concise, as well as it's not something I'm comfortable doing. I usually write short story or other prose, and this was nice to get out of my comfort zone in multiple ways.
Always a fan of people getting out of their comfort zone, except I don't do it, but I'm glad you did.
When I took Professor Gray's Creative Writing 1 class, she encouraged us strongly to do some poetry, write some poetry. And I told her at that time, I just froze. My brain just shut down if somebody said poetry. But since then, I took another class at another college, and I actually fell in love with writing poetry. I was surprised, but I did. But for this one, I thought about doing it in poetry, but I just had too much to say, and short story is my comfort zone.
And I write prose, so easy choice. You all know how I feel about poetry.
Oh, another question in the back.
Jan, I find yours interesting because it's not so much the rah protest, big, overly done, you need to be out there every single moment and in front of a building or in front of a person and, sit-ins and such. So how did you come up with this? Why this particular, I love the conversation in a coffee shop sort of thing. The mood was and the aesthetic is very chill too. So how did you kind of come up with dealing with a serious topic like this with two friends at a coffee shop? And that's why I just want to hear your process about that.
When Professor Baumann asked for volunteers for this, and he said the topic was protest, the very first thing came to my mind is I don't protest. And so I knew that was where I would be going. But as I was saying to him earlier today, I had it all in mind and an idea of how to get to where I wanted to get, but I just couldn't write it. I was just writing junk. I was looking up things, timelines of when things happened and making sure my memory was correct. And but it just was not there. It was yuck. And I've written long enough that I know that what that means is that there's something in my mind that I don't want to know yet. And so one morning, 6 o'clock, I woke up and I knew immediately what it was, and that was that it was too personal. I didn't want to get up in front of strangers and say these things, although I did. But so what I needed to do was get some distance. And so that's when the idea came to me. Two people, just good friends who feel comfortable saying these kinds of things, will be chatting, and they'll have the back and forth. And one will confess, and one will say, yeah, there's another way of looking at it. So, yeah, that's how I came up with it.
Other questions? Surely someone's got a burning question. Oh, I think Jacqueline's got one.
It's a poetry question. It's a poetry comment, sort of. Sydney, your poem was exactly the poem I needed to read today, I needed to hear today, so thank you. And Jan, it is wonderful to hear your words again. It's been a while. And actually, my question for Jan had relates in some way to what Annie was talking about. I was interested in how you had framed it with the coffee shop conversation. When you wrote that, because you dug into memory, did anything surprise you?
Actually, it did, and that my memory was faulty because when I began to look at different timelines so that I could line them up with Sandy's talk about when things happened to her, I realized that I had a lot of the dates and specifics out of order, and that things happened younger than I realized. You know, for some reason I had Rosa Parks in my high school. I mean, happening during my high school, and it didn't. It happened way back in the 50s and those kinds of things. So that was the main thing that surprised me. The other thing that surprised me is how emotional it was, because this has been an argument I've had with myself for many, many years, and felt like that I have skated on the coattails of many really, really brave people, but it's just not me, you know. I'm not getting out there. So I strive really, really hard to live it. So.
I'm an academic. This is what we do. We come prepared with questions so that you have questions to answer. So, Sydney, in terms of yours, I like the shift that I had never thought of cancer as something that you would necessarily resist, and that could you talk a little bit more about why choosing cancer for this? So I think, you know, I always assume abortions, all the kind of preventative care, whatever it is, but why cancer? And if it's too personal, please do not go for it.
Not at all. So I'm actually a huge history nerd. So back clear up until I think the 1970s, if a woman had to get a mastectomy for having breast cancer, they actually removed all of the muscles from the breast and even the upper arm to get all the lymph nodes, and it would severely disable women who needed to get that removed. Like, their arm could not go past this level. And it took a very long time before the medical field actually researched how to keep the mastectomy actually here and less disabling and less deforming for women, as well as it was more of the idea of the perfect woman and the perfect body. And so it was just in the way of the invasion in the female body just in general. But it is another thing to resist, and I actually didn't think about that until just now. So thank you. And also thank you for your compliments earlier, by the way. But yeah, no, it was just more of a history fact.
Ooh, well, one over here in the front. Run, Marvin, run. Or just walk briskly, whatever.
I didn't really have a question. I had more of a statement for Jan. Something that stuck out to me in your short story was when you mentioned tutoring an inner city girl for a long period of time. My mother is a doctorate in science education, and she spent the majority of my childhood tutoring children in the inner cities, in Jennings and places like that. And she often took me along, and we would do that, and then Saturday mornings we would do Missouri Stream Team. And it kind of, it's priceless, because the experiences that I was able to, be a part of were things that I would have never known. Things like most of these children didn't have any access to internet at home. Their parents couldn't afford, $50 a month in internet access, and just things that we were so accustomed to I mean, I didn't grow up extremely rich either, but these things were just not, accessible to these kids. And she did it long past her dissertation and long past, when she was supposed to be stopping with the inner city kids. And it's made an impact longer in her life too than just the kids were. So I thought that was a really good point that you made in your short story.
What is your name, sir?
Oh, Joe.
Joe?
Yes.
Yeah, I was interested because all the boys in the room there and the different things that they were all going through, I think that is a microcosm of kind of what goes on in life and society. And I don't know where that all came from. Can you give us any way that came from? Is that from your experiences or what?
Well, I haven't ever sat in a room full of fellow boys and cried, if that's the question. I'm trying to remember what. I think I just had, sorry, with a lot of the things I write, I actually come up with a title and then go, what's the story there? And I had got in my head, Crying Boys Welcome Here, and was like, okay, what's that? And that is what it eventually became. But I did get that idea, and in case it wasn't clear, stories trying to talk about like this notion of like a kind of like stoic masculinity, right? That is sort of expected of men of varying ages, right? And that you're not allowed in the world to show emotion, particularly you can be happy and you can be angry, but you can't cry, right? And so that was sort of where that story eventually came from once I had that idea in my brain.
And Jan, is it Jan or Janet? Jan?
Yes, Jan, yep.
Jan, yeah, that really, because I'm 78, so I went through all of what you went through, and everything you said in your story really hit a button, hot button for me through the Vietnam War, and the body count really hit me because I remember that and I'm thinking how sick that was. Every day they're talking about how many bodies. These are live human beings, either Vietnamese or American soldiers dying. And I was a protester. I protested the war, and I wish there wasn't a war now between Russia and Ukraine. I pray that we can end that because I feel sorry for the Russians and the Ukrainians. I'm sure the Russian people are not too happy with what Putin is doing, bringing their bodies of their sons back. I remember that in the 70s. It was not a pleasant time. I'm glad guys don't have to live through it.
Anyone else? Last call. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming. We very much appreciate it. And thank you again to Jan and Sydney for sharing their work. And have a great rest of the Democracy Days week. Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you for exposing yourself to strangers.
Okay, that was a weird way to say that, Marvin.
No, in a written format. Thanks, Joe. And remember, Democracy Days continues tomorrow with 3 fresh, brand new presentations. We have panelists discussing abortion issues. We're going to be talking history, as well as Trump impeachment. Can he still run? It's Grand Week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Be here, 10 o'clock. Appreciate you. Sign in. Have a grand day.